Sometimes there are half measures, but don't hassle the half. Cooler Master has a legendary HAF series. And it's back in this box. Let's take a look. Can it live up to the legend? I don't know. On today's episode of One Idiot Opens a Box, now this is a full tower case that'll support mini ITX, micro ATX, ATX, and extended ATX up to 12 by 14.1 inches. You can remove the fan that's located in the bottom to have more room for a GPU, but it's 7 expansion slots total, so you don't have extra expansion slots like you see on some of the super towers. In the top, you could fit 320mm, two 140s, or two 200mm. In the front, you could do 360mm, two 140s, or two 100s, which is what it ships with. Now, the 200mm mounting hole spacing is 154 by 154 with up to 30mm of thickness. At the rear, you've got room for a single 120mm on top of the hard drive cage. That's the fan that's kind of floating in the middle of the case. It's also 120mm. So you could fit 360 rads in the front and top with rear support for only a 120. The CPU cooler clearance is 167mm, the power supply clearance is 180mm, and the graphics card clearance is up to 410mm, depending on what you put in the front. That's what we're working with for the bottom, by the way. This is going to be important later. Now, this is a case that Cooler Master intends to give you some flexibility with in terms of what you mount where. It's a mesh top and a mesh front. That's what you get in the box. There's 2 front panel USB 3 5GB ports. There's a single Type-C port. You get your power button, a combo headphone microphone jack, and a physical reset button. This case is more or less front intake only, but the reason for that is because Cooler Master says that this will perform better for cooling, or be less internal turbulence, more airflow with less energy. Not sure. I can tell you that this case is pretty much designed for the Founders Edition of the NVIDIA cards, where they have one fan that's sort of pulling air in and the other one is sort of exhausting it at the back. That fan in the middle for that sort of a fan configuration can work really well. Of course, if you're using a really long motherboard that is extended ATX, this fan is a little problematic. You'll have to relocate it. Also, kind of surprising, there's no vertical slots at the back, but I think that was done to minimize cost. Fortunately, you do get 4 fans total, 2 120 and 2 200mm fans with this case. That's a pretty good bundle. The tempered glass side panel does snap in, so it is pretty safe to use it without the thumb screw, but if you'd rather lock it in for shipment or whatever, you can use a single thumb screw to hold the side panel in. It does lock in. There's a nice metal lip at the bottom of the glass here, so it works well. Between the top of the motherboard and the top of the case, look at all those millimeters of clearance. If you got one of those really old super micro motherboards that has like the extra lip at the top, it'll fit. No support under it, but it'll fit. There are 2 Phillips screws on the edge here, and that means that the top will just pop right off. This is a really nice feature that's quality of life, because you can take this out, mount it to your radiator, and basically be good to go. You can see that we've got a lot of radiator mounting options. The manual says, dual 140, triple 160. There's some other mounting holes here, depending on if you did want to do dual 200mm. I don't think there's a radiator for that just yet, but you could use that for fans. But again, this is a pretty simplistic design. I mean, it's just this magnetic dust filter. It goes on the top, and that's your only option. That's all that's in the box. But, for the cost savings, Cooler Master passes that on to you. So even though this is a pretty simplistic approach to the top, if you're planning a top-mounted radiator or a front-mounted 360 with your dual 240s in the top, this works great. Having the top open like this really helps simplify the build too, because you can get to all the connectors at the top without a lot of things being in the way. Loosen my bread tie, and there you go. You can change the angle of the fan. Now, in a perfect world, would you even need this fan? The answer is no, because if your front fans are moving a lot of air and doing their job, that's going to force the air to sort of come through the case and go up. If you have a side exhaust video card, it's going to dump the air to the side. Hot air is naturally going to rise. It's going to try to pull air in from the bottom. It's basically okay. But remember, this does not have a bottom air intake. The only filter that's on the bottom is for the power supply. So Cooler Master has modeled this and designed this so that this bottom front fan, the 200 millimeter fan, is going to be bringing in a ton of air over your 3.5 inch drives, which are a nice sort of tray solution, which this is removable, by the way, so you could put a pump or something else there. But the idea is this is going to bring everything around. The power supply shroud, it's also removable, so you could take it out and not fool with it if you don't want it. Held in place with a single thumb screw, so that's pretty much all there is to it. I love this because I've done other builds, and removing the power supply shroud at the bottom is like, you got to take out 8 screws, and then it's sort of a battle to try to even get it to release, but this is pretty nice. There's also a slot cut out here that you can use for cable management if this is in place after you mount your power supply. Now, speaking of power supply, Cooler Master also sent over their MWE Gold 850 V2 full modular. You know, there's a little bit of kerfuffle when the 3080s and 3090 video cards launched from NVIDIA because, well, not just Team Green, but Team Red. I mean, these are 400 watt GPUs that we're rocking. And you do the math and you think, well, a 750 watt power supply would do it with the highest end CPU and the highest end GPU available. But then there were a lot of reports on our forum and others of computers shutting down. And it was because the peak load was tripping the overcurrent protection with some power supplies. Cooler Master has gone out of their way to make sure that that kind of thing won't happen, and 850 watts in this power supply is ample margin for the highest end GPU and CPU devices. The overcurrent protection is not going to trip on this when you're just, maxing out a 3090 or a 3090 Ti, as the case may be. I don't have one of those. I'm trying real hard. In addition to the two 3.5 inch bays, which you could mount 2.5 inch drives in if you wanted to, there's also two 2.5 inch drives behind the motherboard tray. The other side panel has captured thumb screws, which is a nice touch, and 2 of them. This should be ample room for hiding whatever sort of cabling you want to hide back here, or even a couple of drives. Also included with this case is a pretty simple fan hub. It's a combination fan RGB hub, so you can run your RGB from your Cooler Master fans to the hub and then connect that to your motherboard. A lot of motherboards have digital LED headers and that sort of thing. You could connect the LED header to the distribution hub and connect your secondary fan headers to the distribution hub, the fan hub basically, and make sure that your front fans are always spinning at the same RPM. Or you could connect them individually. I mean, some motherboards have like 6-8 PWM fan headers, so not a big deal. The two 200 millimeter fans that are included with this case are 3-pin, and the two 120 millimeter fans included with this case are 4-pin. So just FYI, DC versus PWM control, they are a little different. And out of the box, the 200 millimeter fans are connected to the fan hub. Now the fan hub provides a 4-pin connection to the motherboard, so it'll translate PWM to DC. You don't have to worry about that. So I'd recommend for the front 200 millimeter fans, whether you've mounted them in the front or the top, that you continue to use the built-in fan hub, at least for those 2 fans. In the out-of-the-box configuration, the reset button is hooked up to the RGB controller to change the RGB controller modes. You can, of course, just use that with motherboard reset if you'd rather have reset. It's not hardwired in, and there's ample slack. It's a great little quality of life feature from Cooler Master. They really are a detail-oriented company, and I love that. I love all these little surprises. It's like, look, we're not making the most expensive case on planet Earth, but that doesn't mean that we can't put little niceties, little well-thought-out niceties in the case, and that's the features that you see in this case. It's really nice. Also, with the fan hub in its default configuration, you get 2 4-pin fan headers that are free. You could use a 3 or 4-pin fan with that. It'll figure it out. And you've got 3 digital RGB headers that are also available to plug in peripherals. The rear fan, the rear 120mm fan, is also an RGB fan, which is a nice touch. The rear fan is an RGB fan. I mean with the colors, not that it's a fan of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I guess that would be RBG instead of RGB. Ruth Gator Ginsburg from a parallel universe. The actual removable front is not attached to the USB thing, which is great. But instead of just pulling it to release, I recommend that you push the tabs to help it release, because you could break the tabs if you're just trying to rip it off. You should actually sort of press them to get it to release. And the whole front is mesh. Now there's not a separate dust filter or anything like that for the front, but you can see it's got those enormous fans. Oh no. There goes. I'm free. I'm free for my people. Now, one thing you might notice about these 200mm fans is that they have a solid hub around the edge. Usually you see that kind of thing in an attempt to increase the static pressure of the fan. I don't know how effective that is. Gamers Nexus has got a fan tester. I have a feeling we're going to see exactly how effective that is from Gamers Nexus, but usually the reason that you put in a hub like that is to increase the static fan pressure, which means that it's going to be able to pressurize the case a little bit more and sort of force air to go through the case. Larger diameter fans generally will move more air more quietly, so it has the possibility to be amazing. There's the potential. There's a lot of potential here in this case. But how good is it? How good is it really? Well, we actually have to do a build with it in order to figure that out. Now, putting this together, there are a couple oddities. For other cases that you may have seen and that we reviewed, these drives back here, it's usually a tray of some kind. Not on this motherboard. It comes with these screw peg things that just sort of twist in. You can toollessly install these pegs in your SSD, and then the pegs slide into the holes. This is pretty genius because, one, it eliminates the need for a tray, and two, if you were using screws, you'd have to screw it in from under the motherboard, which is suboptimal. I mean, who wants to screw down their SSD and then install their motherboard? It would be impossible to remove the SSD unless you also remove the motherboard, which is definitely not desirable. With this, you sort of toollessly insert it into the rubber grommets. At first I thought, rubber grommets, you don't really need vibration dampening with an SSD, but the rubber grommets are to hold the drive in place securely without having to have anything fancy. Again, sort of cost down engineering. Of course, that can have downsides as well. You've got a big heavy motherboard. Sometimes the rigidity of the motherboard depends on the rigidity of the case. Well, the motherboard tray on this case does have a little bit of flex to it. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's terrible. I've definitely seen better, but this isn't bad. One other design feature that I like is this cable shroud. It is removable. You could remove this. You can also move these rubber grommets from these holes to another set of holes that are hidden by this cable management thing. So if you are going to use one of the wider ATX motherboards in this case, you could still have rubber grommets, just maybe not the cable shield. Just a couple of screws at the bottom are all that's holding that in. What's the 5-minute summary on the Cooler Master case? Well, it's big on features and relatively small on price for the features that you get. It's unusual to see USB-C plus USB 5 gigabit for your front panel, plus an combination RGB fan distribution block. At the same time, you can definitely tell that Cooler Master has very carefully engineered this case. There are 4 fans included. 2 very nice 200mm fans that do move a lot of air through the system. So, overall, it's going to depend on you. Are you into this aesthetic? Do you want to use this for a build? In terms of airflow and other design considerations and the price point ratio, you're going to have to check and see. There's nothing really that would rule this case out immediately for any kind of a build that you want to do, whether that's high-end Threadripper or a relatively low-end system that's not going to produce a lot of heat. This system would handle an Alder Lake system with a 3090 running 750, 850, 900 watts. It would handle Threadripper, no problem. It would also handle other lower-end systems as well. The noise dampening is maybe not as good as some other cases, but that's because this is a high airflow design. So it's a trade-off. It's a little bit of a trade-off. But I do like what Cooler Master has done with this design. Alright, spoiler alert. So before I get to the build video, there's something important that was discovered during the build. Apart, everything comes once again. This is the front. It's a nice big open front. It's going to breathe pretty well. But, much to my surprise, moving the fans from the front to the top made a big difference in case cooling. Not increasing the number of fans, not changing anything else, other than just moving the fans from the front to the top. And now that I tell you that, it's probably obvious as to why. This is what we're working with versus that on the front. Look how much of the fan is blocked by the solid front panel. That's a lot of area that could be open. This is mostly pretty much sort of kind of open. And you still have plenty of room for the top edge of the motherboard. Tons and tons and tons of room. For whatever reason, this configuration seems to move a lot more air through the case. And I think looking at the front and top without measuring it quantitatively, as I probably should, it seems like this works well. For the build, I've selected relatively low-cost components. A Gigabyte Z690 DDR4. I'd probably go with the B660 instead with DDR4 memory if it had the right loadout. But in terms of onboard peripherals, this is also with an i7. So I've only paired it with the Cooler Master 240mm cooler, which I've reviewed separately. I definitely would recommend a 360mm cooler for this case, though. It's a pretty good value motherboard. I'm really surprised they didn't brand it Aorus, because it is, Aorus is kind of their gaming brand. Because it's a pretty good board. Now this power supply is overkill. It's probably a little nicer than I would use if I were doing a budget build. But then again, if you look at the pricing, some of the pricing on these power supplies is actually better. It just depends on where you get it, what's available to you locally. It's also a fully modular power supply. MWE Gold 850 V2. It's not going to shut off when you throw a 3090 in there. Or if you're a mad lad, 3090 Ti. Oh no, tube's down. Oh well. Power supply installed. Time for power supply shroud. We're dealing with quite a mess. And yes, there is a cutout for your PCIe power, but I'm actually going to come out the front and side because usually the power connector's on the side, so. Now I've got nice clean power for my PCIe peripherals as well as my 3.5-inch peripherals right there. So things are looking pretty good. There we go. And even with reasonable cable management, now depending on what kind of person you are, you might want to mount your 3.5-inch drives, with the connectors turned to the front or the connectors turned to the back. You could flip the cage around, but really it wants the connectors to be in the back. But you can leave yourself enough room at the back to make it easy to swap your hard drives. It's not hot swap, you have to shut your machine down, but it does make it a little easier to swap your 3.5-inch hard drives. Of course, the removable pegs at the back that I mentioned before, those are okay, perfectly fine. There's plenty of room between the motherboard and the side of the case that you've got some room to work with. And we can put our fans in the top, the big fans, the 200mm fans, and it turns into a pretty reasonable build. And we still got RGB in the front, thanks to the new Cooler Master fans. I really should add a third one there. I've got one in a box around here somewhere, but it's fine for now. And here's our more or less complete build. We have 4 RGB fans plus one in the back makes 5. That's going to use all of our RGB connectors on the breakout board. So if you did add a third, for your 360. You'll want to use a splitter or something like that. If you get Cooler Masters, it comes with an in-out bridge thing, so it'll work fine. You won't end up using all of your headers. It's good news. There's also, especially if you're going to use a Founders Edition 3090, there's an optimal fan angle here that improves airflow, and it's about there. And that kind of makes sense because you got the intake from these two on the front, and then it also sort of pulls air in from the bottom, like this lower part here. You don't want to leave a gap at the top. I know there might be a temptation if you do what I did to leave some kind of a gap at the top, but warm air rises and there's a little bit of a danger that the warm air will recirculate, with a gap in the top. So put your radiator at the top, and again, highly recommend 360mm radiator, that is. Now this is pretty much the highest end build that you could do in the system. I mean, you could do DDR5 with an i9, still a 3090, still top end. This case is made for airflow. You're going to hear, some fan noise from this machine. You're going to hear your GPU a little bit from this machine. There's no sound dampening or anything like that in this machine. But that means that you've got really good airflow because everything is mesh and everything is open. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but the fans are kind of ramping up and down as it goes through the boot process. You can also run it without the top mesh here. This does restrict airflow a little bit. If you run it without that, these fans can exhaust more air. Do some experiments. You might be surprised. Your build's probably going to be a little different. But hey, Cooler Master, HAF. The new HAF. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. I'm signing out, and you can find me in the Level 1 forums.